the African-American family. And I think we, in some situations, have struggled to kind of pull that back together. Perhaps over, as a whole, not having the generation after generation after generation of wealth, and to be able to hand down wealth, it becomes somewhat of a struggle. But I don't take anything away from any other race, but I also will not allow people to say, well, we shouldn't always be talking about the blacks, or, blah, blah, blah. You know what, what's going on right now, I believe, is an issue that impacts Black people. And I think it's fair to say that. And, like I said, it doesn't take anything away from the Asian experience, or the Latino or Hispanic experience, or anything like that.
Yeah, it's not a zero-sum game to say that
Correct.
the Black community has experienced an incredible amount of trauma and pain in that regard.
Yep.
Of the reforms that are being sort of tossed around, forget political parties or labels or anything else, of the ideas that are starting to be floated for where do we go from here, are there any that excites you personally as something that you hope to see adopted or enacted? As broad as you want to make it. I'm curious to see. I know as a lawyer, our brains don't ever turn off, so I'm curious to see what's bubbled up in those midnight hours.
I am interested in seeing kind of where this goes, because I think, for the last 20 some years, corporate America has talked about, diversity and inclusion. And I look at that and say, it's good to have those conversations, but in most corporations, diversity and inclusion is aspirational, meaning we'll set measurable goals. If you hit them, wow, that's good. If you don't, that's okay, we'll try better next time.
Right.
Versus if you have a budget and you miss that budget, there's repercussions. Or if you go over budget. So I see this kind of 20-year or more dialogue about diversity and inclusion, and it's still going on. The conversation is still going on. And so I hope that kind of what's happening now as it relates to kind of race relations, that the conversations are had, and that things become, that something seriously comes out of those conversations. And is it something political? I don't know. I really don't. But I am hopeful that there will be substantive dialogue around these issues that will move us kind of to another level, versus it happens for June, July, and August. Oh, you know what? We got to really worry about getting back to school. And, or when the coronavirus goes away and everything kind of opens up, we're now focused on that versus, trying to find some type of significant movement around, race relations, specifically Black or African-American relations with police officers.
That's good. Recommended reading material. I've been asking as well for my friends having these calls with me, like what have you read that you believe well encapsulates either the problem or proposed solutions, or just for context? Is there anything there that you would throw out?
There's a book called Black Rage, and I read it years ago when I was working in corporate America, and I cannot remember who the author is now, but I thought that was interesting. The new Jim Crow law, I think, was interesting. There's a book I'm reading right now that is basically about development of federalism, the federal law in the court systems, and it's coming out of Tennessee, a court in Tennessee, where this African-American man was convicted of raping a white woman, where the evidence was so clear that he did not do it. And I haven't finished the whole book, but there was a community, and they had a lynch mob that was, wanting to kill him. And, they took him to Knoxville, and he was safe for a while. And he loses a trial, and then he has two black attorneys that appeal to the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court stays the execution. And as that stay is going back to the local court, the court's saying, well, we don't think that the Supreme Court of the United States has jurisdiction over us. And they end up coming in, and they drag the man out. And where I've got to it now, they've hung him. And so there's still more to read, but it's interesting to me.
When was this?
This was back in the early 1900s.
Okay.
The early 1900s. And so it's supposed to, the book, I think, when it was recommended to me, was to talk about how the federal court system kind of began to build its jurisdiction. But those are kind of interesting, I think, reads. I would also encourage people, so my wife has a nonprofit called the Colorado Reach, and it is focused on, it started out kind of working with schools to infuse multiculturalism in their curriculums, and has kind of expanded out to not only schools, but to corporations and to community organizations, focused on wanting to have more dialogues like this. They do some training for different companies, and also some strategic planning. But it's been pretty effective in allowing conversations to be had, that kind of providing a safe forum for conversations around race, and how do you kind of move the needle in regards to those conversations.
Yeah, don't have them on social media has been my first discovery.
True.
Oh, you want a good conversation? Don't have it on Facebook.
Yeah.
So in terms of fostering dialogue, you gave the example a few minutes ago of the young lady at school telling your son, something that she may have had completely innocent, just not ever thought of, hey, don't do that.
Right.
And my friend Benjamin said one big one for him is he's an attorney like yourself, and he said, whenever someone comes to me and says, "Oh, you're so articulate," and I hear somebody say that to me, and that makes me all warm and fuzzy inside. But that's the functional equivalent of saying you talk pretty good for a black guy, and so I didn't know if there were any other of those kind of words and phrases that are still sort of hanging out. I'm not talking about racial slurs. I mean just the casual parlance of the day. The only one I've found for myself that I've appropriated for myself is, I'm realizing we only call it rioting when there are people of color involved. It's protesting for literally everything else. It's rioting for some reason when it involves the African American community. So I've tried to pick up on that. Same almost thing for looting. It's breaking and entering most of the time.
Right.
I feel like the looting gets thrown in as soon as it's like a throwback to the 60s. Suddenly we're using all the old language from the 60s.
Right. What you were saying about being articulate, you're right. I've had people tell me, actually clients, when I spoke to a client over the telephone, and then I drove down to his doctor, drove down to meet him because we were going to court. So I'd never met him. He'd never met me. He didn't look me up on the internet or anything like that. And so when I get there, he's like, "Oh my God, you're a black man." And I said, "Okay, I'm going to give him that pass." And then he said, "You didn't sound black on the telephone." And so I'm going to give him a second pass. And the third time he came back, because he was in and out, and he was saying these little things. He'd say them and then he'd leave. The third thing he said was, "Well, I used to have a black friend, but he lived on the other side of the railroad tracks." And so it was interesting, because at that time I stopped him and I said, "Doctor, you don't know anything about me." And I said, "A little bit
Stop here."
But it was interesting. And is it his lack of exposure, or was it that he was exposed and his exposure was to or his preconceived notion about black people were a certain way? Um, that's interesting. I would also say that it doesn't matter how educated you are, how well dressed you might be, how much money you make, what job you have. As a Black man, at the end of the day, you are a Black man. And that's, the reality that I live with. It's the reality that, I think we have raised our sons with. They went to Catholic schools. And, a lot of times when they would go out and hang around with their Caucasian friends, our conversation with them was, look, you cannot do the same things they might be able to do and get away with it. And that was hard, I think, for them to understand. But eventually, I think they, understood it. Some people might say that's so negative, or, you're just, kind of talking about something that you're trying to make happen or that you think will make happen. And to that, I would say, that is my reality. And at the end of the day, that is how the conversations I have to have in order to ensure that my sons come home.
And to me, that's what it boils down to. I've got two daughters, and, obviously they're Caucasian, but there are things that, white boys will be able to do that they won't be able to do without me worrying about if they're going to make it home or not. And that has nothing to do with race. And yet it's the heart of the parent that says, I have to look out for the negative because you're too young and you don't know what it's like out there. And so I have to give you this internal code to live by so that I can at least feel like I've done my job as a parent, as a father, and say, I want you coming back in one piece tonight. And this is the best way I know how to tell you that that's going to be accomplished is,
exactly,
some of these things you can't do. And so that for me is because it is a negative, where are we and how do we inject the positive side? I mean, again, you're right. These dialogues they've been incredibly educational for me, and I hope for the people that are watching them. But there's also this growing fire of, I want to do something. We can talk about this issue a lot, and it's not about knowing what to do. There are plenty of resources and action items. You can find those all over the internet right now. But there's also part of me that wants to do something that's going to be effective. I do want my kids and grandkids to grow up in a different America than the one I grew up in, which is at least is better than the ones that our grandparents grew up in, but they're not, we're a long way from there. And I'm trying to figure out what to do so that there gets here a lot sooner than it seems to be coming right now.
Yeah. I think we all are, trying to figure out what is it. I do think, though, that it starts with some really courageous conversations. And I'm interested in how long have you been doing this and what possessed you to do it?
What possessed me to do it was a Blackout Tuesday possessed me to do it. A lot of my friends did the Blackout Tuesday thing on Instagram or Facebook, and you're scrolling through your feed that day, and there's just a lot of blank screens, and you're like, oh wow, this is really cool. And I asked one of my friends, I said, does this land for you? Does this feel like typical safe white response? I'm sitting in my bedroom and I'm going to just make my screen black and that's it, or is this actually making you feel like there's some actual solidarity with what's going on right now? And he said, actually, it does. It does make me feel good that people are stopping to take the time to make that change. But for me, it didn't feel like I was doing anything beyond my own personal profile, right? I don't want to sit with my own stuff. I need to break out, get a little uncomfortable, talk about white privilege and what that really looks like and what that really means find out the pieces that I've been missing. And to do that meant